when I was a student at Swinburne Uni studying early childhood, one thing that really had an impact on my life, I think, in the way that I thought about programming was the anti-bias curriculum from Pasadena in California. And I was lucky enough a couple of years later to actually go on a travel fellowship, and I was looking at anti-bias curriculum, non-racist programming, and also Indigenous curriculum. And so I think really for me, looking at the US, Canada, Europe, and the types of resources that they had that reflected an anti-bias curriculum and Indigenous communities is something that has shaped the type of resources and the programs that we actually conduct in Yarn Strong Sister.
So I was more interested, I think, in the curriculum studies and started off thinking really about the curriculum areas, being interested in those, and became particularly interested as a student teacher in children where English was a second language. It was something I'd never thought about through my own childhood, about what it was for children who went to kindergarten for the first time and had never didn't speak English. Going into my teaching course, I hadn't thought about children being in those kinds of situations. So initially I was interested in how curriculum could support those children through multicultural, I guess, education. By the time that I finished my training as a student, what I had realised was that a lot of the ways that we approached multicultural education was very tokenistic. It was about visiting cultures, it was about going there, looking at other people and then going back to what was normal. I also thought that a lot of things that we did were stereotypical and that they didn't actually teach children anything about diversity. So my favourite one was always children making fried rice, and that was supposed to teach children something about being Chinese. And I guess that where that came from in myself was having a father who was born in Hong Kong. I knew that people from Hong Kong didn't actually eat fried rice, they ate boiled rice. So I thought that whole idea was ridiculous. When I started teaching, I still remained interested in what could you do to make multicultural education? What could you do to teach children about diversity in interesting and meaningful ways? But I didn't know how to do that. When I started my teaching career though, I went to a community where just about everybody was white and they were middle class. And I started to think about, well, what did multicultural education mean in that kind of context? That same year that I graduated was the first year that the anti-bias curriculum was published, and I was very fortunate that a colleague was actually studying in Pacific Oaks and wrote to me and said, I think you need to have a look at this book. And so I sent off and I think probably got one of the first copies of the anti-bias curriculum in Australia, because it was before it had come to Australia. And I started to experiment with that book, and I think there was one quote that book was published in 1989, which is when I started my career. And so in 2011, there is still one quote in that book that stands out for me above everything else. And that is that learning to believe that you're superior because you're white, male or able-bodied is actually as damaging to children as learning to believe that you're inferior because you're not all of those things. And I started to think about what that meant for children. What did it mean for the children I was working with, white middle-class children, learning to believe that they were superior because of their experiences? I started off, the anti-bias book was one of the most important books that I ever encountered, but also Patricia Ramsey's book, Teaching and Learning in a Diverse World. And I think for the first 10 years of my career, I carried those books with me backwards and forwards to work every single day and used them as my inroads into exploring other ways of thinking. The other thing I think that about anti-bias that was really important was that it introduced me to a child that I'd never been introduced to before in my teaching career, which was the child who knew about race, the child who knew about gender, the child who knew about class and age and ability, but also the child who was making judgments about people on the basis of those things. My teacher education course never spoke about those kinds of things, but here was a text that was telling me that children think about these things, they know about those things. I started to experiment with the ideas in the anti-bias book, and I started to talk to other parents. I started to talk to children first of all about what they knew, and unsurprisingly to me now, what I found was that they knew exactly what people in the anti-bias book said that they did know about. They actually did know about race, even though they didn't necessarily have contact with people of colour or with Asian people or with Indigenous people. They knew about those people and they had ideas about those people, and they were making judgments about those people. I experimented with a lot of things, and I talked with children and I got their ideas, and then one day I got the courage to tell a parent about what I was doing, because I did this in secret. These were conversations, because I didn't really know that I was convinced myself that children really did notice difference, even though they were actually telling me that they did. And I had this conversation with a parent one day, and she said, "But do you really think children notice?" And by that stage, I did think children did notice. I knew that they noticed because they told me that they noticed, but I didn't know how to explain it to her. And that was the process then of starting to work back through the different theories that had informed anti-bias curriculum, looking at who influenced them. So I went to the reference lists and I started to look at, well, who did they read when they were putting the anti-bias curriculum together? So people like Carol Brunson Phillips, their work that they used. I went back through a lot of the early work around race and racism. So people like David Milner, who'd done some of those early studies, Mary Ellen Goodman, looking at the Clark and Clark study, which was one of the very first studies into how children developed ideas about race.
So for me, the origins of phenomenology in my research practice come through what I actually like to refer to as the anti-bias education that I sort of got involved in Portland with my elders from kind of my early days. So what happened is I became really interested in the life experiences of others in our area, especially as children would come into my own classroom as a teacher, and their parents would come in, and we'd want to have these dialogues and conversations where we would open up really tough subjects, like when I would have, say, a two-mom family, like lesbian family, coming into the classroom, and I had another family whose dad, the mom was interested in our school's philosophy around building relationships with people who are different from us, but the dad didn't want to do that, and so he would have this challenge about, I don't want you teaching my child about these gay parents, and I would say, well, that's what we do in our school. That's who we are. That's how we live together. And for me, that lived experience became so critical as a way to not only articulate a story or tell a story about people's lives. So I sort of attach phenomenology to the narrative and the way we tell stories about ourselves. But I also then think we make meaning through those stories in a way that's very critical for others to be able to see and feel and touch the lives of those around them. So that's really the beginnings, the origins for me of kind of understanding how we make meaning in the experience and of people around us.
And so that started me on a new journey in exploring diversity and thinking about curriculum with young children. It wasn't a series of activities that you put on tables that were really there more to entertain children or to develop hand skills, cutting skills, those sorts of things. I started to realise that what was more important was that children's developing attitudes and the way in which they worked together and saw each other and were able to collaborate. So I started focusing a lot of my curriculum work in that sort of area. I still was writing things in boxes, and that became more and more problematic for me because it was too hard to write some of the kind of things I was working on, like around diversity, around recognising stereotypes, around building up skills in how to deal with exclusion or to recognise unfairness and those sort of things. So that started to shift a little bit at that time as well. But I still felt that I should write things in boxes and put it on the wall for everybody to see. But the beginning of that anti-bias work has really stayed with me ever since. And I think it will be part of who I am, not just at work, but in my own life. You can't put it away, you can't put it down. It's an ongoing way of teaching and thinking about the world and the way you view the world. And when people say at our centre we don't have a gender issue, it's because they're not tuned in. That's not what they're really looking for and thinking about, and so they read things differently. So I guess the anti-bias curriculum has helped me to read my work differently, read how I view children differently, read what I think is important differently and what I prioritise. So these days I don't write things in boxes anymore. In fact, probably more what I would do is write a journal. So I keep a book of what is going on, what children are thinking and saying, what staff are noticing, what are the interactions that are happening, what are key things going on around us, and how do we make sense of that and unpack those things with children and work through them. So I don't have a curriculum on the wall anymore.
The moment in my career when I think I began to see that what I do really does matter was when Maria, a little Greek girl, came to my preschool, and she didn't speak any English. And she probably had not been to any early childhood programs in town. And so she was very tentative, very shy, cried a little bit when her mother left her, but settled in fairly quickly, and she became part of the group. And of course, like many preschools, I would get the big book and put it on an easel and have a pointer, and I'd be reading to the children with the pointer to highlight the words. And after about 3 weeks, I was walking by that little room where we'd have a little withdrawal room, I think we called it, where we had those story times. And there was Maria with the pointer, reading the book, you know, had the big book set up, and she's reading it. There's nobody in front of her. She's got the pointer. And then she goes, "Sit down." And then she says some more, "Sit down." Now this child, those were the first English words I heard her speak. And I thought to myself, how could that be the most important thing that this child has taken out of all the wonderful things I thought I was doing with her? But it's because children pay attention to what matters. And she could see that what mattered in my preschool at that time was that the children stayed sitting down, and I must have said that word a lot, and I was not conscious of that. I was not aware that I was saying sit down all the time, and that was her first introduction to the English language.
Throughout visiting the services as my role as facilitator, the difference in what you see has been something that I really have started thinking about too, in regards to how is culture represented, how is the diversity visible. And some people think that having the cultural artefacts, having pictures, posters is tokenistic or window dressing. One of the points that stuck with me at a inclusion support facilitator statewide training was Karen Martin was the speaker who was talking about invisibility and erasure. And this made me think about some of the practices of having artefacts, posters, and other things that actually, other symbols that represent culture is important within a children's service. I do believe that we have to be aware that without something visual, without something consistently at the forefront in regards to cultural competency, it could create an invisibility of that culture. When culture is so important to a child feeling safe, as if they belong, we need to have that culture represented within our service. And visuals are certainly a good way to do that, as part of the practice, with an understanding of why it is there. It helps put the practice into a context. For example, if a family brings in an artefact representing their culture, you could also get the family to tell the story of the meaning behind that artefact. During the project, we had the opportunity to go to the art gallery and do some art-based research. And we were going through the Buddhist section of the art gallery, and there was a sculpture of a Buddhist footprint. And our guide mentioned that in museums, these sculptures, these artworks are out of context. And so she started telling us the story behind the footprint. And it was a rather spiritual piece. And through the storytelling, you could actually start to feel that spirituality, the meaning behind the Buddha's footprint and what it represented. And I think this demonstrates beautifully how this can affect children and families within a service when they have the opportunity to share the meaning behind their artefacts and the practices that they do within their own homes.